The first rays of dawn painted the Arizona sky in shades of amber and rose as Ruby May Rodriguez saddled her chestnut mare behind the Silver Dollar Saloon. The town of Red Canyon still slept off the previous night's revelries, leaving only the whisper of desert wind and the distant cry of a hawk to break the morning silence. Ruby breathed deeply, savoring these precious moments before another day of performance and pretense began. At 24, Ruby had learned to cherish solitude. Her nights belonged to the saloon, dancing for miners, cowboys, and drifters who paid good money to forget their troubles for a few hours. But her mornings belonged to the desert, where she could shed her stage persona and remember who she really was beneath the silk dresses and painted smiles. Bella whinnied softly as Ruby adjusted the stirrups, her dark eyes reflecting the same restlessness that drove her mistress to seek refuge in the wilderness. Together, they rode out through the sleeping town, past shuttered storefronts and the skeletal remains of buildings that hadn't survived the harsh frontier economy. The desert stretched endlessly before them, a landscape of red sandstone mesas and rolling dunes that shifted like frozen waves. Ruby had grown to love this unforgiving beauty, so different from the green fields of her childhood in Missouri. Here, survival depended on strength and adaptability rather than sentiment or wishful thinking. An hour into her ride, Bella suddenly shied away from something ahead. Her ears flattened against her skull. Ruby squinted against the growing heat, spotting a dark shape near a cluster of weathered boulders. At first, she assumed it was another piece of desert debris, perhaps an old saddle or abandoned equipment left by some unlucky traveler. But as she drew closer, the shape resolved into something far more disturbing. A man, unconscious and half buried in the shifting sand. Ruby dismounted quickly, her heart racing as she approached the figure. He lay on his side, his clothing torn and sun-bleached, lips cracked and bleeding from severe dehydration. Sand had begun to drift over his legs, and she realized with horror that he might have been here for days. Kneeling beside him, Ruby checked for a pulse, relief flooding through her when she felt the weak but steady rhythm beneath her fingertips. The stranger was young, perhaps her own age, with dark hair matted with sand, and a face that would have been handsome under better circumstances. What struck her immediately was the quality of his clothing. Despite the damage from sun and sand, his shirt was made from fine cotton, his boots from expensive leather. His hands, when she examined them for injuries, were soft and uncalloused, the hands of a man who'd never known hard physical labor. A glint of metal caught her eye, and Ruby carefully extracted a gold pocket watch from the sand beside him. The engraving on its surface read, "To James with love, Mother," but the inscription was partially obscured by scratches from its ordeal in the desert. "James," Ruby murmured, studying the stranger's peaceful face. "What brought you out here to die, James?" The practical side of her nature demanded she leave immediately. Taking in strangers was dangerous business in Red Canyon, where everyone minded their own affairs and asked no questions. But something in the young man's vulnerability touched a chord deep within her, perhaps because she remembered too well what it felt like to be lost and desperate. With considerable effort, Ruby managed to drape the unconscious man across Bella's saddle. The mare protested the extra weight, but eventually accepted her burden with resigned patience. The journey back to town took twice as long as usual, Ruby leading her horse carefully through the sand while keeping one hand on the stranger to prevent him from sliding off. Red Canyon was beginning to stir as they approached the outskirts of town. Ruby guided Bella through the narrow alley behind the Silver Dollar, grateful that most residents were still sleeping off their Saturday night excesses. She managed to get the stranger into her small private room without being seen, a stroke of luck that she hoped would hold. The room was modest but clean, containing only a narrow bed, a washstand, and a trunk that held her few personal possessions. Ruby had lived in worse places during her journey west, and she learned to make any space feel like home with small touches, a few wildflowers in a tin cup, books stacked neatly on the windowsill, a colorful quilt her grandmother had made years ago. She cleaned the stranger's wounds with whiskey and fresh water, noting the severity of his sun exposure. His breathing was shallow but regular, and his pulse gradually grew stronger as she worked. When fever set in that evening, Ruby wasn't surprised. The desert claimed its victims slowly, and survival often depended on careful nursing as much as initial rescue. For 3 days, she maintained a careful routine. During the day, when the saloon remained relatively quiet, she tended to her patient, bringing him water, cool cloths for his fever, and small amounts of broth when he could manage to swallow. At night, she performed her usual duties downstairs, dancing and serving drinks while her mind remained focused on the man fighting for his life in the room above. The fever broke on the fourth morning, and Ruby found her patient's brown eyes focused and alert for the first time since she discovered him. He studied her face with an expression of confusion mixed with profound gratitude. "Where am I?" he asked, his voice hoarse but carrying the refined accent of someone well-educated and likely from the East. Ruby settled into the chair beside his bed, noting how his eyes tracked her movements with sharp intelligence. "Safe," she replied simply. "You've been unconscious for 4 days." "For days?" He struggled to sit up. Wincing as movement revealed the extent of his injuries. Someone might be looking for me." "Maybe," Ruby agreed. "But right now, you need to rest and regain your strength. What's your name?" She watched his face carefully, noting the long pause before he answered. "Jake," he said finally. "Jake Morrison." The hesitation was obvious, but Ruby had learned long ago that everyone in Red Canyon carried secrets. Pressing for details would only make him suspicious of her own motives. "Well, Jake Morrison," she said, rising from her chair. "You're welcome to stay until you're strong enough to travel, but I'll need you to keep quiet during business hours. This isn't exactly a hotel." Jake's eyes took in their surroundings, the sound of voices and music drifting up from below, the feminine touches that marked this as her private space, the practical simplicity that spoke of someone who lived by her own rules. "You're risking a lot for a stranger," he observed. Ruby paused at the door, looking back at him with an expression that revealed nothing of her thoughts. "Everyone deserves a chance to start over, Jake Morrison. That's what the frontier is for." As she left to prepare for another night's work, Ruby couldn't shake the feeling that this mysterious stranger would change everything about her carefully ordered life. Whether that change would be for better or worse remained to be seen. Jake's recovery progressed steadily over the following week, though Ruby noticed he seemed reluctant to discuss his plans for leaving. During the quieter daytime hours, when the Silver Dollar resembled any other frontier establishment rather than the raucous entertainment venue it became after dark, they fell into an easy pattern of conversation that surprised them both. Ruby discovered that Jake possessed an extensive education, speaking knowledgeably about literature, history, and current events in a way that revealed both formal schooling and natural intelligence. His insights into political developments back east were particularly astute, though he seemed to grow uncomfortable whenever their discussions touched on governmental affairs. "You've read Whitman?" Jake asked one afternoon, noticing the worn copy of Leaves of Grass among Ruby's small collection of books. "Borrowed it from a schoolteacher before she moved on to California," Ruby replied, settling into her usual chair beside his bed. "I like his honesty about America, the beautiful parts and the ugly ones." Jake's eyes lit up with genuine enthusiasm. "I never expected to find someone discussing poetry in a frontier saloon. And I never expected to find an educated gentleman dying in the desert," Ruby countered. "I suppose we're both full of surprises." Their conversations revealed shared appreciation for beauty and meaning that transcended their different backgrounds. Jake spoke eloquently about music, describing concerts he'd attended in Boston and New York with an obvious longing for cultural refinement. Ruby, in turn, shared her love for the raw authenticity of frontier life, the way hardship stripped away pretense and revealed people's true character. "You miss it," Ruby observed one day, watching Jake's face as he described a particularly moving performance of Chopin's piano concertos. "The elegant life you left behind." Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring out the small window at the red rock formations in the distance. "I miss the beauty of it," he admitted finally. "The music, the art, the intellectual discourse. But I don't miss the emptiness underneath all that refinement. Emptiness, the way people could discuss literature over champagne, while ignoring the suffering of those who served their drinks. The way moral principles became political tools rather than genuine beliefs." Jake's voice carried a bitterness that made Ruby study his face more carefully. "I grew up thinking that education and privilege automatically made someone noble. The frontier teaches different lessons about nobility. Ruby felt a flush of pleasure at his words, recognizing the rare gift of being truly seen and valued by someone whose opinion mattered. Jake looked at her not as an object of entertainment, but as an equal worthy of intellectual respect. "Tell me about your family," Jake said one evening as Ruby brought him dinner. She hesitated, and used to sharing personal history with anyone, but something in Jake's gentle attention made her want to trust him with pieces of herself she usually kept hidden. "My parents had a farm in Missouri," she began slowly. "Good land, good people. But 3 years of drought, followed by an early frost, destroyed everything. Papa sold what he could to pay debts, but it wasn't enough." Jake listened without interruption as Ruby described the painful decision to leave her family and seek opportunities in expanding territories. She told him about the long journey west, the false promises of easy prosperity, and the harsh reality of making a living as a single woman in frontier towns. "I learned to dance back home, just for fun at church socials and barn raisings," Ruby continued. "But dancing became survival when I realized it was the only skill that could earn decent money quickly. The Silver Dollar isn't the most respectable establishment, but Bill Morrison treats his girls fairly and doesn't tolerate customers who can't behave themselves." "You're talking about the sheriff?" Jake asked with surprise. "His older brother. Bill owned this place long before Tom got elected sheriff. It's a family business, you might say." Jake absorbed this information thoughtfully, his expression revealing nothing of his inner thoughts. "Do you ever regret the choice? Leaving your family for this life?" Ruby considered the question seriously. "I regret the circumstances that made it necessary," she said finally. "But I don't regret learning that I could survive on my own terms. There's freedom in that knowledge, even when the price is high." Their conversations weren't always serious. Jake possessed a dry wit that emerged as his strength returned, and Ruby discovered she enjoyed matching verbal sparring with someone who could appreciate clever wordplay. He also revealed an unexpected talent for storytelling, entertaining her with carefully edited tales of his travels west that managed to be amusing without revealing too much about his real identity. "You play piano?" Ruby asked one evening, noticing how Jake's fingers moved unconsciously across an imaginary keyboard while she hummed a melody. "Some," Jake admitted. "My mother insisted on lessons, though I'm probably quite rusty now." Ruby gestured toward the old, upright piano in the corner of the saloon's main room. "Show me." Late that night, after the last customer had stumbled home and Bill Morrison had locked the front doors, Jake settled onto the piano bench with obvious pleasure. His fingers found the keys with practiced ease, producing a melody so hauntingly beautiful that Ruby felt tears spring to her eyes. "Chopin," Jake said softly as the last notes faded into silence. "Nocturne in E-flat major. My mother's favorite piece." Ruby watched his face transform as he played, seeing glimpses of the refined world he'd abandoned. Whatever had driven him to the desert had cost him more than comfort. It had cost him a fundamental part of his identity. "She must miss you terribly," Ruby said gently, Jake's hand still on the keys. "She died 2 years ago. Pneumonia." The simple words carried depths of grief that made Ruby's heart ache for him. She understood now why he'd spoken of emptiness beneath elegant surfaces. He lost the one person who made that world meaningful. "I'm sorry," she said, moving to stand beside the piano. "She would have liked you," Jake replied, looking up at her with an expression of wonder. "She always said that true refinement came from kindness rather than breeding. That genuine nobility existed in how people treated those who couldn't help them in return." Ruby felt heat rise in her cheeks at the implication of his words. "Jake, I know," he said quickly. "I know this is complicated. I know I have no right to say such things when I'm still hiding so much from you." "Then stop hiding," Ruby challenged. "Trust me with the truth." Jake's hands found the keys again, playing a melancholy melody that spoke of loss and longing. "Some truths are too dangerous to share," he said finally, "especially with someone you care about." The admission hung between them. Like a bridge, neither was quite ready to cross. Ruby felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble under the weight of growing affection, while Jake struggled with the knowledge that his real identity could destroy any chance of happiness they might find together. But love Ruby reflected as she watched Jake's graceful hands coax beauty from the battered piano. Had never been convenient or safe. It demanded courage to risk everything for something that might not last beyond tomorrow. For now, it was enough to sit beside him in the lamplight, listening to music that spoke the truths they weren't yet brave enough to voice aloud. The peaceful rhythm of Ruby and Jake's developing relationship shattered on a scorching Tuesday morning when three men in dusty but expensive suits rode into Red Canyon. Ruby watched from the Silver Dollar's front window as they dismounted outside the sheriff's office, their horses lathered from hard traveling and their faces grim with purpose. Everything about the strangers marked them as outsiders, from their city clothes to the way they moved with urban confidence rather than frontier caution. They carried themselves like men accustomed to authority, and Ruby felt her instincts sharp with alarm as she observed their serious discussion with Sheriff Morrison. "We're looking for someone," the leader announced when the conversation spilled onto the town's main street. His voice carried clearly across the dusty square, designed to be heard by the growing crowd of curious onlookers. Senator William Harrison's son, last seen heading into the territory 3 weeks ago. Ruby's blood turned to ice water in her veins. She gripped the window frame so tightly her knuckles went white, pieces of a dangerous puzzle suddenly clicking into place with terrifying clarity. Behind her, she heard Jake's sharp intake of breath and knew without turning that he'd heard the pronouncement as well. Senator William Harrison, the powerful Boston politician whose moral reform campaign had been making headlines throughout the territories. The man who'd been calling for federal intervention to shut down saloons, dance halls, and gambling establishments across the frontier. The politician whose righteous crusade threatened the livelihood of every person who made their living in establishments like the Silver Dollar. Young James was last seen in Santa Fe. The man continued, producing a photograph that he showed to various townspeople. "We have reason to believe he may have come this way. Anyone who can provide information about his whereabouts will be generously compensated." Ruby forced herself to remain still and silent as the men questioned residents throughout the afternoon. Most folks claimed ignorance, truthfully, since Jake had arrived unconscious and remained hidden during his recovery. But Ruby caught the subtle way people's eyes avoided the stranger's direct gaze, the frontier instinct to protect their own against outside interference. That evening, after the men had taken rooms at the town's only hotel, Ruby confronted Jake directly. She found him sitting on the edge of his bed, head in his hands, looking like a man facing execution. "William Harrison," she said without preamble, her voice carefully controlled despite the storm of emotions raging through her. "The senator from Boston who's been calling for moral reform laws. The one who wants to shut down every saloon and dance hall from here to California." Jake raised his head slowly, his brown eyes filled with anguish and resignation. "Ruby, please let me explain. Your real name," she demanded, though she already knew the answer. After a long moment that seemed to stretch for eternity, Jake whispered, "James William Harrison, Jr." The words hit Ruby like a physical blow, even though she'd been expecting them. The son of the man whose political crusade represented everything that threatened her world, her livelihood, her future. The irony was bitter enough to choke on. "Why?" The single word escaped her lips as barely more than a breath. Why run from a life that most people would kill for? Jake's carefully maintained composure finally cracked, revealing the raw pain he'd been hiding beneath his genteel manners. "Because I couldn't be who he wanted me to be," he said, his voice breaking. The perfect political air, spouting his rhetoric about moral superiority while watching him destroy lives for the sake of votes. He told her about growing up in the shadow of Senator Harrison's ambitions, about private conversations where his father revealed the cynical calculations behind his public positions, about the families Jake had met whose lives had been ruined by the very moral reform laws his father championed. Women forced into prostitution, when dance halls closed, men driven to crime when their gambling debts couldn't be resolved through legal means. "I've seen what his policies really do, Ruby," Jake continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke his truth. "They don't eliminate vice. They drive it underground where it becomes more dangerous and exploitative. But telling my father that was like arguing with granite." Jake described the final confrontation with Senator Harrison, the ultimatum that had driven him to flee east into the territories. conform to the family's political expectations, or be disowned completely, support laws he knew to be harmful, or lose everything he'd been raised to inherit. So I chose the desert, Jake finished quietly. I thought if I disappeared completely, it would be easier for everyone. He could claim I'd been killed by frontier savages, maybe even use my death to justify more aggressive federal intervention. Ruby stared at him, seeing both the privileged senator's son and the broken young man she'd rescued from the sand dunes. Her heart ached with the impossible complexity of their situation. Loving someone whose very existence represented a threat to everything she'd built for herself. "Those men downstairs are looking for you," she said quietly, stating the obvious because she needed time to process the enormity of what she'd learned. "I know." Jake reached toward her, then stopped when he saw her flinch away from his touch. "Ruby, I never meant for you to get involved in this. I never meant for my past to threaten you." She pulled back from him, feeling her carefully constructed walls slamming back into place as survival instincts overwhelmed growing affection. "Maybe you should go with them," she said, the words tasting like poison even as she spoke them. The hurt that flashed across Jake's features nearly broke her resolve. But Ruby had survived too long in a dangerous world to let sentiment destroy her now. Loving the son of Senator Harrison was more than complicated. It was potentially suicidal. "Ruby." "No," she said firmly, moving toward the door. "I need time to think about this. Time to figure out what it means." As she reached for the door handle, Jake's voice stopped her. "For what it's worth," he said softly, "meeting you has been the most honest thing that's ever happened to me. You saved my life in more ways than one." Ruby didn't trust herself to respond. Instead, she fled to the sanctuary of her work, losing herself in the mechanical routine of serving drinks and dancing for men who saw her as entertainment rather than a person facing an impossible choice. But even as she smiled and performed, her mind raced with questions that had no good answers. What would happen to Jake if he returned to his father's world? What would happen to her if their relationship became known? And most frighteningly of all, what would happen to her heart if she lost the first man who'd ever seen her as truly worthy of love? Jake left in the dark hours before dawn, slipping away like a ghost to surrender himself to his father's men, rather than bring further danger to Ruby or the people of Red Canyon. Ruby discovered his absence when she brought him morning coffee, finding only a brief note expressing his love and gratitude, along with his mother's gold pocket watch left on the pillow. To remember that some things are worth more than gold, the note read in Jake's careful handwriting. "You taught me that nobility isn't inherited, it's chosen. I love you, Ruby May Rodriguez." Ruby clutched the watch to her chest, tears streaming down her face as she realized that Jake had used her full name, the one she'd never told him, the one that connected her to the proud Mexican heritage her father had asked her to hide for safety in Anglo territories. Somehow, he'd seen through all her careful deceptions to the truth of who she really was. The next few days passed in a haze of mechanical routine. Ruby danced and served drinks, smiled for customers and deflected unwanted advances. But her heart felt as empty as the desert wind. She told herself that Jake's departure was for the best, that their relationship had been doomed from the start, but the rational arguments couldn't ease the ache in her chest. Sheriff Morrison brought troubling news to the weekly town meeting, his weathered face grim with concern. "Senator Harrison's coming to Red Canyon," he announced to the assembled residents. "Wants to see firsthand how his son lived among us. What did he call us? Degenerates and moral defectives." Ruby felt sick imagining the senator's cold eyes judging everything Jake had come to understand and value. Worse, she feared what Jake's return to that world of political calculation and social manipulation might cost him. Would he revert to the empty, privileged existence he fled, or would he find the courage to maintain the integrity he discovered in the desert? When Senator Harrison's elaborate entourage arrived 3 days later, Ruby watched from the Silver Dollar as a transformed Jake emerged from an expensive carriage. Gone was the gentle, thoughtful man she'd come to love, replaced by a stiff figure in formal clothes who held himself with rigid propriety. He wore his privilege like armor, his face revealing nothing of the emotions that Ruby knew must be churning beneath the surface. The senator himself was an imposing figure, tall and silver-haired, with penetrating blue eyes and the commanding presence of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. His voice carried easily across the town square as he held impromptu court, delivering speeches about moral decay and the need for federal intervention in territorial governance. "My son's ordeal among you people has only strengthened our resolve," Senator Harrison declared, his tone managing to be both condescending and threatening. He's seen firsthand the corruption that infects these frontier communities, the way vice and lawlessness destroy the moral fiber that holds civilization together. Ruby's temper flared at the casual dismissal of everything she and her neighbors had built from nothing. Red Canyon wasn't perfect, but it was a place where people looked out for each other, where hard work was respected regardless of background, where second chances were possible for those brave enough to seize them. But before she could voice her anger, Jake stepped forward, his movement so sudden that even his father seemed surprised. "Father, that's not true," Jake said, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd like a blade. The town square fell absolutely silent. Senator Harrison's face darkened with warning, his eyes promising severe consequences for this public contradiction. But Jake continued speaking, his voice growing stronger and more certain with each word. "These people aren't corrupt, they're survivors," he declared, his gaze finding Ruby's face across the crowded square. "They built something meaningful from nothing, created communities based on mutual respect rather than inherited privilege. They've shown me more genuine kindness and moral courage than I ever found in Washington's drawing rooms." "James," Senator Harrison's voice carried a note of deadly warning. "We discussed this matter privately. Your temporary confusion is understandable given your ordeal, but—" "No, sir," Jake interrupted, and Ruby felt her heart leap at the steel in his voice. "You talked, I listened, but I won't stand here and let you vilify people who saved my life and taught me what honor really means." He turned to face Ruby directly, his eyes holding everything he couldn't say in such a public forum. "Ruby May pulled me from the desert when I was dying of exposure and dehydration. She asked for nothing in return except that I be honest with myself about who I wanted to be." Senator Harrison's face contorted with rage and humiliation at being contradicted so publicly. "You forget yourself, boy. You forget what you owe your family, your heritage, your future." "I forget nothing," Jake replied calmly. "But I've learned the difference between owing respect and owing blind obedience. These people have honor you'll never understand, Father. They judge by character rather than pedigree, by actions rather than rhetoric." The confrontation escalated quickly, father and son facing off in the dust of Red Canyon's main street while the entire town watched in fascination. Senator Harrison to the full weight of his authority and threats into breaking his son's rebellion, promising disinheritance, political destruction, social exile from everything Jake had been raised to value. But the young man who'd been shaped by desert hardship and frontier honesty stood firm against a storm of paternal fury. He'd found something worth fighting for, and no amount of intimidation could make him abandon it. "Then I choose exile," Jake said finally, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "I choose truth over your lies, integrity over inheritance, and love over political ambition." Senator Harrison's face went white with shock and rage. "You're no son of mine," he snarled. Jake's smile was sad but genuine. "No, sir, I'm my own man, and that's worth more than anything you could ever give me." As the senator's entourage prepared for their furious departure from Red Canyon, Ruby felt her frozen heart begin to thaw. Jake had chosen their world over his inheritance, chosen her over everything he'd been raised to value. The magnitude of his sacrifice both thrilled and terrified her. But as she watched him standing alone in the settling dust, she realized that love required courage from both sides. Jake had risked everything for the chance to build something real with her. Now it was her turn to be brave enough to meet him halfway. Ruby waited until the senator's dust cloud disappeared over the eastern ridge before approaching Jake in the town square. He stood with his shoulders straight and his face turned toward the setting sun, looking like a man who'd finally found peace after a long internal war. "That was quite a speech," Ruby said quietly, coming to stand beside him. Jake turned to her with a smile that held both sadness and relief. "I've been practicing it for weeks, ever since I realized I couldn't live with myself if I let him destroy what we've built here. We, this town, these people, us." Jake's voice grew soft with emotion. "Ruby, I know you have every reason not to trust me. I know the situation is complicated and dangerous and probably completely insane." Ruby studied his face, seeing the boy who needed rescuing and the man who'd chosen honor over comfort. The desert had burned away his pretensions, leaving someone genuine beneath all the inherited expectations. "Your father will never forgive this," she observed. "I'm counting on it," Jake replied with surprising firmness. "I spent my whole life trying to earn approval from a man who measures worth by political usefulness. I'm done with that particular form of slavery." "It won't be easy," Ruby warned, though her heart was singing with hope. "His political enemies will try to use your defection, and frontier life isn't gentle for those raised in comfort." Jake's laugh was genuine and full of joy. "I'm tougher than I look. Besides, I have an excellent teacher in survival skills." Over the following months, Jake proved his commitment by working alongside Ruby to transform the silver dollar into something more than just a saloon. He organized reading classes for local children, taught music lessons to anyone interested, and used his education to help townspeople with legal documents and correspondence with relatives back east. Ruby watched him evolve from privileged refugee to valued community member, his genuine care for others winning over even the most skeptical locals. Bill Morrison offered him partnership in the saloon's operations, recognizing both his business acumen and his dedication to the establishment that had become their second home. "You're not the same man I pulled from the desert," Ruby told him one evening as they sat on the saloon's back porch, watching stars emerge in the clear desert sky. "Neither are you the same woman who saved him," Jake replied, taking her hand gently. "We both changed, grown into who we were meant to be." It was true. Ruby had discovered that love didn't require abandoning her independence or strength. Jake appreciated her intelligence, supported her ambitions, and never tried to diminish her accomplishments to make himself feel more important. In return, she'd learned to trust someone with her vulnerabilities without fear of exploitation or betrayal. Their relationship became a model for the kind of partnership that frontier life demanded: equal contributions of strength, wisdom, and determination to build something meaningful together. Jake never condescended to Ruby about her background or profession, while she never resented his education or used his past against him during disagreements. When news reached Red Canyon that Senator Harrison had suffered a severe stroke and withdrawn from public life, Jake felt only sadness for the brilliant man who allowed political ambition to consume his humanity. He wrote a letter to his father, the only communication they'd had since the confrontation, expressing forgiveness and inviting reconciliation on terms of mutual respect. The senator never replied, but Jake found he could live with that particular silence. He built a new family in Red Canyon, surrounded by people who valued him for who he chose to be rather than what he'd been born to inherit. Ruby's transformation was equally profound. The defensive wall she built around her heart slowly crumbled as Jake proved day after day that love could be safe, that trust could be honored, that partnership could enhance rather than diminish individual strength. "I want to ask you something," Jake said one evening as they rode through the desert where their story had begun. The sun was setting behind the red rock formations, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that took Ruby's breath away. He dismounted near the spot where she'd found him 6 months earlier, then helped her down from Bella's saddle. In the fading light, he knelt in the sand that had nearly claimed his life, pulling out a simple gold band that caught the last rays of sunlight. "Ruby May Rodriguez," he said formally, his voice thick with emotion. "Will you marry me? Not because you saved my life, not because we've been through trials together, but because I can't imagine building a future without you as my equal partner in everything that matters." Ruby looked down at him, this man who'd given up everything he'd been taught to value for the chance to build something real with her. The magnitude of his sacrifice still overwhelmed her sometimes, but she learned that love wasn't about keeping score of who owed what to whom. "Yes," she said, pulling him to his feet and kissing him as the desert wind whispered its approval around them. "But we do this as true equals, Jake Harrison. No compromises on that." "Wouldn't have it any other way," Jake laughed, spinning her around as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "Though I was thinking of taking your name instead of keeping mine. Jake Rodriguez has a nice ring to it. Ruby's heart swelled with love for this man, who understood that marriage should add to their individual strengths rather than diminish them. Jake Rodriguez it is, she agreed, though you'll have to learn Spanish if you're going to carry a Mexican name properly. I've always wanted to learn Spanish, Jake grinned. Just another adventure we can share. Their wedding took place in Red Canyon's small church 6 weeks later, with the entire town in attendance. Bill Morrison walked Ruby down the aisle, while Sheriff Tom Morrison performed the ceremony, cementing their adoption into the close-knit frontier community they'd both chosen to call home. As they danced to piano music under a canopy of desert stars, Ruby reflected on the strange path that had brought them together. A spoiled senator's son dying in the sand, a saloon dancer risking everything to save a stranger. It seemed like the beginning of a dime novel rather than real life. But the love they'd built was absolutely real, tested by hardship and strengthened by mutual respect. They'd learned that true partnership required both people to be whole and complete individuals before they could create something greater together. Any regrets? Jake whispered as they swayed to the music, his arms strong and sure around her. Ruby looked up into his eyes that held all the love and commitment she'd never dare hope to find, and smiled with complete certainty. Only that we didn't find each other sooner, she replied, then kissed him as their neighbors cheered and the desert wind sang its ancient song of survival, transformation, and enduring love. Red Canyon's most unlikely love story had become local legend. The saloon dancer and the senator's son who'd found truth in each other and courage in the unforgiving beauty of the American frontier. But for Ruby and Jake, it was simply the beginning of their greatest adventure, building a life worthy of the love that had transformed them both.